Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing a build that has been requested ever since I started doing these kind of boss battle builds based on Fromsoft games, and that is Rellana the Twin Moon Knight. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this one was tricky. Very, very tricky. There were so many iterations that I ended up going through while trying to keep the overall look of Rellana as a boss, like kind of get the general design right, which is hard to do in BG3, as well as trying to get a leveling scheme that I felt worked, because we needed a whole bunch of things. We needed some form of damage that was going to represent the magic damage that Rellana does, we needed fire damage, we needed dual wielding, and we needed the appropriate armor as well, and it really stumped me for a while, to the point where I didn't even want to attempt the build. But I do think I have something here that will work for us. Now, don't get me wrong, it could definitely be optimized a little bit further with certain buffs here and there. For example, the Mirror of Loss could actually really help this build, and I did have to use Ethel's Boon to make this one work the way I wanted to, and there are a couple of other ways that I would build this build if I wasn't deliberately trying to make a Rellana build. I just kind of wanted to use this concept, in which case some changes to the fashion could actually really help this build, but otherwise I wanted to get it as close as I could, because that's what this channel, I guess, is about. So with this build, what you're going to be getting out of this is a mixture of damage types, the ability to dual wield. You'll be a full martial fighter, but as well you'll also be able to do, you know, various different types of spell casting, because Rellana, while she is mainly a fighter, she does weave kind of like, you know, magic sword attacks and, you know, flame attacks into her moveset, as well as her signature move, Rellana's Twin Moon, which is a big AoE explosion. And don't worry, I've got all of that. And I do have a sort of phase change mechanic in this build, but it's not quite as substantial as the other two, because with the other two kind of bosses that I was basing it on, they had like full big transitions into phases that made a big difference. Whereas Rellana, yes, her phase transition does give her a few new moves, but the only thing that really changes is that her swords kind of light up visually. So it's not as big of like a visual change as the other builds, but it is still a significant kind of buff to the overall playstyle that you use when you get to a certain amount of HP. Anyways, I'm not going to keep you at the intro for much longer. Let's just get straight into the build. Kicking things off, we're going to start as a rogue, which may seem weird, but rogue is going to give us a ton of things that I want for this build. You can probably already guess why. We are going to, I mean, you could see kind of what I'm going for here. We're using finesse weaponry, which means sneak attack is going to work for us, so that's a bit of extra damage on our attacks if we have advantage, and trust me, we'll have ways of getting advantage. On to the ability scores. Starting off as a rogue, we get a lot of skill proficiencies, and our stats are a bit strange. So dexterity is going to be at 17, because that is the stat that we're going to need to buff up with Ethel's Boon to make it an 18 in order to make this build work. And you're going to be focused more on melee attacks than spellcasting in the early game, so having your dexterity be higher than your spellcasting to start is going to make sense. Constitution's at 14. I would like this higher, but in the end it didn't really matter, because by the time this build is finished, our AC is going to be so high that we're not really getting hit anyway, so maintaining concentration and having a higher HP pool isn't really going to matter. But don't worry, we will have the ability to get a little bit more HP as the build goes on. Next up, intelligence. I have that at 10 just because, I mean, intelligence is the spellcasting stat for you know, sorceries in Elden Ring. Unfortunately, I couldn't really work wizard into this build. I originally had a version of this build that was like a paladin wizard, but it just didn't really work. Again, trying to make the fashion work and like trying to get everything. I do think this build that I've come up with today is the closest, but there's definitely some alterations you could do to it, which again, I'll go over a bit later. And next up, we have wisdom. Wisdom is at 16, as it is going to be our main spellcasting stat, and I've dumped strength and charisma because we don't need them. And if you know Rellana's backstory, having 8 charisma makes a lot of sense. Elden Ring Walnuts will know. Anyways, as for our proficiencies, we have a lot. I'm playing a human, so I chose religion as my extra proficiency. I chose the sage background for arcana and history. And then for my rogue proficiencies, I've chosen sleight of hand, insight, investigation, and perception. I've also gone with expertise in arcana and insight. Feel free to play around with these as much as you like. We have no charisma, and again, Rellana isn't really a talker, so I didn't go for any of the charisma stats. Let someone else be the face of the party. Next up at Rogue level 2, we're going to gain the ability to hide, dash, and disengage as a bonus action through cunning action. Yeah, these are always just blanket useful skills, so nothing really to talk about here. Next up, at level 3, we are going to get our Rogue subclass, and of course, if we're dual wielding, we're going with Thief. Thief is going to give us an extra bonus action that means if we're dual wielding at this point, which you can absolutely do if you have light weapons like short swords or scimitars, you're not going to be going for long swords straight away because, let's be honest, long swords is the closest we can get to light great swords in this game. So this is going to allow us to basically have up to 3 attacks in a turn at level 3, which is really, really good. We don't have 2 weapon fighting yet, unfortunately, and we are going to have to get that for a piece of equipment since there wasn't really room for a fighter level in this build, unfortunately. So you're not going to be getting the most out of your offhand attacks yet, but they're still there, and in the early game, even without the added bonuses, they're still pretty strong. So that's going to work out pretty nicely for us, as well as we gain resistance to falling damage. Not really relevant here, but, you know, never know when it could help. Next up at level 4, I would say if you're playing this through with this build throughout the whole game, I would take level 4 of Rogue here and pick up the dual wielder feat. Then with that, being able to pick up Dexterity 18 from Ethel's Boon, you will have dual longswords by this point, because both of the longswords that we're going to be using in this build, you already know them, they come very, very early in the game. You'll have pretty much the martial side of this playstyle down packed by level 4, and then you can respec into the final build later. So I would definitely go to Rogue 4 as you're just playing the game normally, and then respec a bit later. But for now, I'm going to show you what the final build looks like, so we're going to multi-class into Cleric. Now, why Cleric? Again, you guys would probably be thinking, oh, he's definitely going to use Wizard, or, you know, Fighter, or Sorcerer, or something, probably Paladin, but no, we're going with Cleric, and let me explain why. I had to really adapt this build to make sense in Baldur's Gate 3, because obviously the way Elden Ring handles damage types is a bit different. Sorceries in that game kind of just do magic damage. Well, we don't really have a magic damage. I mean, Force does exist, but Force is very, very hard to be able to get onto builds that don't inherently get it in a different way. For example, there's not really a way to naturally buff your weapon with Force, which is what I would be trying to do here, nor is there really many decent Force spells. I mean, Magic Missile obviously exists, but it didn't really work for me. There's Thunder as well, which I did consider, and Thunder will be a part of this build a little bit, but it didn't quite feel right. I couldn't really explain why, so I had to look at it from a different angle. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute. In Elden Ring, all of these kind of sorceries, especially the ones that Rellana uses, are based on the moon. So in BG3, the moon is represented through radiant damage. So I shifted the focus of the build slightly. I've made this a Radiant Fire build, and if I'm looking for Radiant and Fire damage, well, there's no better place to look than Light Cleric. Light Cleric is going to give us access to the normal Cleric stuff, including Radiant, spells and cantrips, but now, thanks to Light Cleric's domain spells, we're also going to get access to fire attacks, as well as some other useful abilities. Overall, this just felt like a good direction to take the build. It makes it really strong overall, as Radiant is not often resisted, as well as the fact that, getting to combine it with fire as well, and because we're going to be playing a full spellcaster, going for this left-handed spellsword type idea for this build, it really does work out. Also, Cleric is going to get access to some unique spells, which are going to work perfectly for Rellana's Twin Moon attack. So overall, this is still a Rellana build, it's based on her, but it's not exactly 100% correct to Elden Ring's damage mechanics. It uses different damage types, but the overall idea is definitely still there, and I think you guys are going to like this one. And like I said, there will be some alternate ways to build this as well. For example, I could also see Tempest Domain being recommended. Tempest Domain would give you access to heavy armor and all martial weapons, which could be useful, as well as if you really wanted to play into that kind of elementless damage type that sorceries get from Elden Ring, then Thunder, like I said, is actually a pretty good shout, as well as the fact that you'd get a bunch of melee-related abilities to augment your spellcasting, but you wouldn't get as many fire abilities, in fact, pretty much none at all, so I think Light Domain does make more sense for this build, but Tempest Domain could also work. Now, as for our cantrips, again, if we're going for Radiant and Fire, well, heck, we've got both right here. Sacred Flame and Produce Flame are Radiant and Fire damage cantrips, which both have their own kind of thing going for them. Sacred Flame causes a saving throw and does Radiant damage, whereas Produce Flame is an attack roll that you throw or can hold onto and does fire damage. Overall, pretty fun. And of course, we're going to grab guidance for those ability checks. For our deity, I'm going to keep it as Selûne. Again, she's kind of the deity of the moon and the stars and all that shtick. I mean, that kind of makes sense for this build, so let's stick with that. We're also going to gain access to 4 level 1 spells. Of course, I want to start off with Guiding Bolt. This is going to be kind of our substitute for Rellana's ranged sorcery attack, allowing us to channel the power of the moon to do a bit of radiant damage, 4d6 radiant damage to be precise, as well as our next attack roll against the target that we hit with Guiding Bolt is going to have advantage, which of course can trigger sneak attack for a little bit of extra damage on our sword strikes. So it all comes together quite nicely, especially with the fact that you can cast this as an action and then attack twice with your offhand. So now we are going to be kind of a full spell blade, spell sword type build, which just feels great to use. So yes, I am substituting kind of Elden Ring sorceries for radiant damage throughout this whole build. Let me have this one. This build was really hard to make, okay? Next up, of course, I'm going to pick Sanctuary, one of the best utility spells in the game, and we might as well pick up some healing options as well, but really, it's entirely up to you. Next up, at Cleric level 2, we're going to gain access to our Channel Divinity charges, replenished by a short or long rest. They're going to fuel some abilities of ours. For example, Turn Undead, which all clerics get, but for us, we're going to get Radiance of the Dawn, which allows us to basically use our Channel Divinity instead of using a spell slot to do a big radiant damage attack, dealing 2d10 plus 3 damage, and that power will go up as we level up. It does say it uses the sun's divine power, but we're just going to ignore that and say it's the moon's divine power. It also dispels any magical darkness, so that one encounter in the cloister in Act 3, yeah, not going to be as big of a deal with this one. We also do get to prepare another spell. Choose whatever you like, it really doesn't matter. Next up, at Cleric level 3, we're going to get a couple of more light domain spells, namely Flaming Sphere, which I am going to flavor as a flaming avatar of the moon because it's a circle. I don't know, probably don't use this one too much. However, Scorching Ray is a really good range damage fire spell, dealing 66 fire damage across 3 targets, or the same one 3 times, or all that damage just kind of gets coalesced into one. I mean, it does 2 to 12 fire damage per array, which is where the 66 comes from. Math is hard, and I'm not good at it. But Scorching Ray is a good spell, so use it. We also do get to pick up some other spells at this point, and I'm absolutely going to recommend that you grab Aid. Aid is going to give you more hit points, which is going to make up for our lower constitution. I'd say you're probably going to, since we're only going to get up to 1 level 5 spell slot by the end of this, you're probably not going to want to upcast it too high. I would say level 3 or 4 will be more than enough, because that will give you a pretty decent hit point pool, as well as any temporary HP you can get from allies as well. Next up, at Cleric level 4, we're going to gain access to another cantrip, so I'm just going to grab Resistance, or you could grab Thaumaturgy if you like, but remember our Charisma skills aren't exactly the highest. We're also going to get another prepared spell at this point, and really, there's not really too much else I would say is absolutely necessary for the build, but Hold Person is great for any martial character, basically allowing us to guarantee critical hits. Not really on theme for the build, but you could absolutely just pick that one up. We're also going to get our first feat at this point. Again, if you were playing up until this point, with level 4 of Rogue, this might be where you want to multiclass. It's entirely up to you, but we are going to be picking up Dual Wielder at this point. Dual Wielder is going to allow us to use 2-weapon fighting, even if our weapons aren't light. Longswords are not light, so we do need to pick this one up. If you wanted to skip Dual Wielder entirely and just use light weapons like scimitars or short swords, again, if you're not going for the fashion of Rellana specifically, then you can drop this feat entirely and pick up 2 light weapons that are just light on their own, like short swords would be my personal recommendation, and then you could put this into something else, perhaps ability score improvements or the like. So again, I'm trying to be as accurate to the Elden Ring character as possible, but if you don't care about that, then you can absolutely optimize this build further by taking out and adding and removing things. But this build, just because this feature is required, it doesn't mean it's not good. We gain a +1 bonus to armor class while wielding 2 weapons, which means our armor class is going to go up even higher. Like I said, when we get to the end of this build, our armor class is going to be very, very high, so it's quite good overall. Next up, at Cleric level 5, we're going to get access to level 3 spells, including Daylight, which I'm going to be flavouring as Moonlight, as well as Fireball, one of the most iconic fire damage attacks. Can't have a Pyromancer build without Fireball, and, I mean, yeah, there's nothing wrong with having Fireball on this build. We're also going to get Destroy Undead, allowing our Turn Undead to also deal radiant damage, so again, kind of fits the theme. And now we also get to pick level 3 spells. I would say I would drop Bless at this point, because we're probably not going to be concentrating on it that much, to pick up Spirit Guardians, because of course we're a melee cleric, we definitely want Spirit Guardians, and as well as Glyph of Warding, because it comes with fire, thunder, all sorts of different elemental attacks, which can fit for the build. So kind of pick and choose what you want here, but this would be my personal recommendation. Next up, at Cleric level 6, we are going to gain an extra Channel Divinity charge, meaning that we'll have 2 total at this point, but we will gain access to another one later, as well as improved Warding Flare. I forgot to mention the basic Warding Flare at level 1, which allows us to use our reaction to basically cause disadvantage on an attack roll against us. Now we can do it for our allies as well, meaning that we're even harder to hit. Not only are we going to have extremely high AC, we're also going to be able to impose disadvantage on attack rolls against us, which is huge, and now we can do it for allies as well, but let's be honest, we're mainly going to be doing it on us. We're also going to get an extra level 3 spell, and since we've already got some healing spells, we might as well grab Mass Healing Word. Healing is not going to be our focus, but you never know when it can come in handy. At Cleric level 7, we're going to gain access to level 4 spells, including Wall of Fire, and just another decent fire spell. We're probably not going to be spending our concentration on this one too much, but it is there if we want it. We do also gain access to Guardian of Faith. I personally didn't use it in my testing because it's not really on theme for the build, but it's there if you want it. We're also going to gain access to other level 4 spells, and at this point I definitely want to pick up Freedom of Movement. Freedom of Movement is just a great spell. It allows us to snap ourselves or an ally out of stun. Well, I guess not us if we can't cast it while we're stunned, but it would prevent us from being stunned, as well as difficult terrain cannot slow us down, and we cannot be magically restrained or paralyzed. And so basically it just means we get a bit more, well, freedom of movement, which you can't go wrong with. It's a really nice buff spell. Next up, at Cleric level 8, we're going to get the Potent Spellcasting ability, meaning now that our Cleric cantrips deal additional damage equal to our Wisdom modifier. We're also going to get to pick up another feat at this point, and yes, I do know that it took until level 11 to get Wisdom higher than 16. Don't worry, we'll have ways of helping out with that in the equipment section. So that may seem a bit weak at the moment, but trust me, it'll make sense once we get to the equipment section. Trust me. We also gain access to another level 4 spell at this point, and I am going to be picking up Death Ward. Allows us to protect a creature from death, that being us. The next time damage would be reduced to 0 hit points. We remain conscious with 1 hit point left. Sorry, the text was messing me up. So yeah, basically it allows us to not die instantly if we're going up against something quite strong. And finally, at level 9 of Cleric, we're going to gain access to level 5 spells, including Flame Strike being added to our list, which does fire and radiant damage, very on theme, as well as Destructive Wave, which I am considering to be Rellana's twin moves. It creates a massive shockwave that targets everything around you that deals thunder and radiant, or necrotic damage, but we're going to be doing radiant, and can possibly knock enemies prone. This is our big attack that we kind of use in phase 2. Unfortunately, due to the fact that we only have 1 level 5 slot with this build, we're only going to be able to use this once per long rest, barring any equipment interference. So it's entirely up to you kind of how you want to go about this, and again, I will have an alternate way of making this build in the description later on in the video that would actually allow us to use this much more, but otherwise for the build that I've got here today, we're only going to be able to use it once without any equipment. But it's still really, really good. You probably only need to cast this once per fight, if I'm being honest. It is that strong, but we'll see how we go. Anyways, moving on, we do get to pick level 5 spells at this point, and I'm going to grab Mass Cure Wounds, and your final spell can be whatever you like. I use Protection from Poison in my testing, so I went up against some enemies that can use poison, so I'll get that here. And that is the build. My camera's being weird. Don't know why. There we go. That is the build, and overall what you're going to be getting out of this is a lot, actually. You're playing a left-handed spell sword, which I've gone on record to say is one of my kind of favourite builds in this game, and you can see why right off the bat. Being able to cast spells and still get 2 attacks off in a turn with your melee weapons, it feels great. It's basically the dream of any kind of spell sword build, both in tabletop and BG3, as well as having access to so many powerful abilities: Destructive Wave, Flame Strike, Radiance of the Dawn, Spirit Guardians, buffing spells like Aid, Freedom of Movement, big fire damage spells like Fireball and Scorching Ray, Guiding Bolt is a generally great ranged blast attack that can give us advantage, as well as, you know, skill buffing skills, I guess. Can't speak today. Like Guidance, and also Sanctuary, which is just great utility, and Healing. You're going to be getting pretty much everything out of this build, as well as with dual wielding and the equipment that I'm going to be showing off. You're going to feel really, really powerful. So let's get into it. So, as you can see here, we are going to be dual wielding the classic dual wield combo. Let me just organize my inventory here. We are going to be dual wielding Falaraluf and Larithian's Wrath. I've got Larithian's Wrath in the main hand because that will give us access to its unique attack, Razor Gale, as well as we have Falaraluf in the offhand, and we'll still have access to Falaraluf Melody. This is basically the best way to do things. I know I've used this combo quite a lot because obviously these are the two dexterity-based longswords in the game, meaning that we don't have to focus on strength, dex, con, and wisdom all in the same build. It allows me to be a bit more kind of versatile with my build making. And these weapons are absolutely no slouch. Falaraluf is honestly one of the strongest weapons in the game thanks to Falaraluf Melody, which allows us to use Sing or Shriek, and we're going to be using Shriek to add thunder damage to all of our attacks, for enemies that were within the radius for 5 turns. This is part of our phase transition. Let me show you the phase transition real quick. So, the phase transition is going to be that when you reach half HP, you're going to activate Falaraluf's Shriek, as well as the haste effect from the Darkfire Shortbow. The Darkfire Shortbow is going to give us resistance to fire and cold damage, which is great, because cold damage is kind of part of Elden Ring's like sorceries as well, so it kind of fits. As well, but with this, haste is going to give us an extra action, meaning that we can either attack twice with our main action or cast 2 spells with our main action, and then we can attack twice with our bonus action. By using the Darkfire Shortbow to cast haste, we can immediately cast Falaraluf's Shriek right after, giving all of our attacks an additional 1d4 of thunder damage, as well as making us a lot faster, giving us more movement speed, making us just feel quicker and deadlier, much like Rellana herself. As well as combining this with the Strange Conduit Ring, now that we're concentrating on haste, we're going to gain an additional 1d4 psychic damage on all of our attacks. That's a lot of damage stacked up, because of course we are buffing these two weapons to get fire and cold damage on them. Again, I went for cold damage rather than thunder here, just because I felt like that cold damage, again, kind of the frostbite of the moon spells that you get from Elden Ring. I think it's like Rani's Dark Moon, and again, the moon kind of has a thing with frost in Elden Ring, so I decided to go with cold here, cold and fire, but you could do fire and thunder as well if you think that's better. So the way I do this is I used a Drakethroat Glaive to buff one of the weapons, the one that's probably going to be in the offhand. And then we use the Flail of Ages to buff the main hand weapon, because if you have the Flail of Ages in your offhand, when you use its ability Elemental Age, which is... oh, I've just lost that. Yeah, Elemental Age. It's kind of like a more limited version of the Draconic Elemental Weapon spell, but if you cast this while the flail is in your offhand, your main hand weapon will get buffed. There'll be more information in the wiki page linked to the description, which means that with this strategy, you can have 2 different kind of elemental weapon buffs on 2 different weapons without actually needing the spell. So, again, Larithian's Wrath is now a +2 weapon with fire damage, and Falaraluf is now a +2 weapon with cold damage. Overall, the phase transition, while it's a bit typical to some of my more usual builds, it's still very, very strong. Again, that +2 to AC that we're going to get from haste, as well as the additional action and movement speed, we'll have a total of 26 AC in our second phase, meaning that we're just not going to get hit, as well as the fact that we'll have such high damage attacks because we'll have so many different damage types stacked on top of each other. It's going to be insane, and they're all different damage types, which meaning it's very, very unlikely that an enemy is going to be able to resist all of them. But anyways, let's get into the rest of the equipment. First up, the Fashion Helmet option, the Oathbreaker Knight Helmet. Now, this is called the Oathbreaker Knight Helmet because that's what the mod that I use to add the weapons and armor calls it, but this is actually called the Golden Glow, or the Gloss Glow Helmet, I believe it's called. It'll be linked in the description, and you can find it in Act 2. It has the exact same effect and the exact same model, it's just named differently. It is the same model as the Oathbreaker Knight set, so basically this was the closest I could get to Rellana's helm in the game. I think it looks pretty good, and if you are trying to get that exact look, then this is what I would go for. However, there are a couple of other options I would use in the earlier game until you get this, or if you don't care about the fashion, you can bump up the kind of stats here and kind of make this build a bit more effective overall. So if you want to go purely for the fashion of Rellana, then this is what you do. Otherwise, I kind of tried to make Rellana's face as like what I imagine Rellana to look like under the helmet, because actually in her boss fight, She has really long hair. But anyways, if you wanted to use a different helmet option, then the Helmet of Arcane Acuity is going to be really helpful as you progress throughout the game. Whenever you deal damage with a weapon attack, remember we can do that twice per turn, we're going to gain Arcane Acuity, which gives us a +1 bonus to spell attack rolls and spell difficulty class for each remaining turn. This stacks up to +10, which means that even though we're going to have low wisdom for the majority of our playthrough here, that's not really going to matter because our spell attack roll and spell save DC will be so high because of all the weapon attacks that we'll be doing. So this can be a really good way to kind of patch up that lower spellcasting stat as you kind of progress through the game. And if you really wanted to, instead of, and this is another thing you could do something similar to my Lady Maria build, the Bloodborne one from a while back. You could actually use the Helmet of Grit in Act 3, and instead of going for 3 levels of Rogue, go all the way in Cleric, gaining 3 feats, access to all the spells, more spell slots, and then get your second bonus action when you're under 50% HP, basically getting your phase transition to give you your extra bonus action that way. But again, I already did that for another build, so I didn't really want to show that off here, but I think the Helmet of Arcane Acuity would be my main choice to replace the helmet if you don't care about wearing it for the fashion reasons. But so yeah, go for the Helmet of Arcane Acuity if you so desire. Next up, the Cloak of Protection. Again, I just wanted as much AC as I could get on this build, and the Cloak of Protection is going to help with that, as well as kind of helping out with the fashion as well, kind of getting us that blue cloth that Rellana kind of drapes over her. Unfortunately, it goes over her front in the original, and I can only really get it to go over her back here, so that's a bit of a shame. Next up, we have the Armour of Agility. This is the best dexterity-based medium armor in the game. Because we multiclassed into Cleric, we gain medium armor proficiency. It adds our full dexterity modifier to our armor class, as well as does not impose disadvantage on stealth checks, as well as it gives us a +2 to our saving throws. With our 18 in dexterity and our other buffs, that is where the majority of our AC is coming from, which just means even without our AC buffing equipment that we have here, we're still going to be at a solid 21, well actually 22 from dual wielder as well, so this is kind of overkill, but I really wanted high AC on this build to patch up that lower constitution, so I decided to wear this one here. But yeah, like I said, the Armour of Agility is really, really great. However, if you do have access to heavy armor proficiency, there is a piece of heavy armor that I have here that I think looks closer to what Rellana wears in the game, at least from a color theory perspective, I guess. This is the Chain Mail +2. If you took a if you took a class, maybe Tempest Cleric, like I said, that gives you heavy armor, you could wear this. Overall, it is weaker, but I do think it looks a bit closer to the fashion, so if you wanted to go with that, you could, but I would personally recommend the Armour of Agility, regardless, as I think it just looks better anyway. Next up, the Gloves of the Balanced Hands. This is what's going to give us access to the 2-weapon fighting style without actually having to multiclass into fight it, because again, we had to go all the way to level 9 of Cleric to get Destructive Wave, so it was a bit tricky to go for anything else, but like I say, if you don't care about just like the level 5 spells, then feel free to play around with the leveling scheme as well. But Gloves of the Balanced Hands, I mean, there was nothing I was really going to replace it with. There's not really any gloves that this build specifically needs that would kick it up into the next gear. Maybe the Helldust gloves for an extra d6 of fire damage, but honestly, we've got enough stacking damage that would just be overkill, so the Gloves of the Balanced Hands enabling this playstyle with this leveling scheme is perfectly fine with me. And finally, the Evasive Shoes for another +1 to our armor class. Swap this outfit for anything you like, but again, I wanted really high armor class, and this is how I got it. Next up, the Amulet of the Devout. This is going to give us a +2 bonus to our spell save DC, again helping patch up our slightly lower wisdom, but you can swap this out for anything that you like, but this does give us an extra usage of Channel Divinity once per long rest, so I personally think that's pretty good, but you can swap this out for something else, including the Spellcrux Amulet. Basically, what I would do is I would have the Spellcrux Amulet at the ready, because what you can do is when you phase transition, you can use the fact that you'll have 2 actions, basically to cast Destructive Wave, use the bonus action spell slot restoration here, because this is a bonus action using one of your 2, and then immediately either cast Flame Strike or another Destructive Wrath to gain the full, the full Twin Moon spell combo. You can either change it up with both of the different spells if you wanted to kind of make it like Fire and Thunder, or you could cast this one twice if you want to be a bit closer to the original. That's what I could do. That could be part of your phase transition, restoring that spell slot to just go boom, boom, and just absolutely destroy everything around you. But of course, this only works once per long long rest, so once you've used up the Spellcrux Amulet, if you don't want a long rest immediately after, which you probably could at this point, you probably have enough resources, you can then swap over to the Amulet of the Devout to gain all of its bonuses. So that's kind of how I would do that. And while I did already show off the Strange Conduit Ring for that extra psychic damage, I will quickly show off the other ring, the Ring of Arcane Synergy. We have 2 cantrips that we can use and a pretty decent spellcasting stat score at this rate, so we can, whenever we deal damage with a cantrip, we'll gain Arcane Synergy, which adds our spellcasting modifier to the damage of our weapon attacks. So overall, it's just going to make us even more powerful than we already are, stacking on even more damage. This build is incredibly powerful. I would call it a glass cannon. Overall, we'll kind of get into the combat footage now as I've kind of shown everything off. This build is a glass cannon, okay? It has a high amount of AC, which means it can potentially be in the thick of things and not even get hit. Again, a maximum of 26, sorry, when haste and everything is up. So in our phase 2, we're going to be quite powerful. As well as the fact that we have such massive offensive capability. Valor Eluve, all of the different stacking buffs, everything that we have here can really make us super, super strong. But the thing is if we get hit, our lower constitution modifier means that we're likely to break concentration and we won't have a lot of HP to work with. We can patch that up with aid, but our slightly more limited spell slots that we have kind of make that not something that we might always want to spend our spell slots on. And again, I would say the biggest tragedy of this build, in my opinion, is that without the Spellcrux Amulet, we can only use Destructive Wave once, which feels a bit rough. But again, even though Rellana is capable of using her Twin Moon spell multiple times per fight, she typically will only use it once anyway. This is still going to feel like a pretty powerful build. It's still got a very solid phase transition like all of my other boss fights, but of course you could just pile it all on from the start and just say, fuck phase 2, we're just going to go straight to phase 3, motherfucker, and just kind of start hitting everything. And again, all of the buffs and different offensive options that you have such a wide array of damage options, including Radiant, which is not very often resisted. So you've just got a ton of stuff to work with here. Overall, this build is really, really strong. You just have to be a bit careful about that glass cannon aspect. But the fact Warding Flare even can patch up that kind of chance of getting hit as well, imposing disadvantage. So really, once you've kicked it into overdrive with phase 2, you're probably fine. Your biggest weakness will be, and this is from my testing, will be area of effect spells. Those can absolutely ruin your day. So things like Fireball, or even Plant Growth to some extent, or like Spike Growth, basically things that can damage you past your AC. That has a chance of breaking your concentration, so do be careful. But yeah, and like I say, you can build this as a full cleric if you want to use the Helmet of Grit. You could build this with like Tempest Cleric if you want that heavy armor and some other options. There's quite a few different ways to do this build. If you really, really wanted to kind of drop Destructive Wave, start off with a level of Fighter to gain Constitution Saving Throw proficiency, which will help with the concentration, as well as the 2-weapon fighting style, which would allow you to trade out your gloves. There's a ton of different ways you can do this. It's entirely up to you. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave that there. There's not really much else to say. I think this build is extremely solid. I think it's extremely fun. And I think I got as close to the character as I could. Again, there's optimizations to be made, though. I would personally, if you're playing just for power, swap out the helmet for the Helmet of Arcane Acuity, like I said, as well as using the Mirror of Loss to bump up either Wisdom or Dexterity. Probably Dexterity. Again, if you're using the Helmet of Arcane Acuity, you don't really need as much of your spellcasting ability. Or maybe even use it to bump up Constitution. That could honestly be very good as well, as 18 in both Wisdom and Dexterity is enough, but that Constitution is really lacking. So feel free to change it up. I will also say that all of the armor in this kind of build was colored in Boreal Blue, except for the helmet, which was Harlequin Black and White, but again, feel free to play around with that as well. So yeah, that's the build, and that is the video. I think I'm going to leave it off here, so thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.